Hello, everyone.
What's up, Alex? How's it going?
Going very well today. Very excited about this.
Me too. Let's get Adam in here, and I'll go ping ping Aaron really quick. Rizzo's going to be a little bit late. He has a bit of a refrigerator emergency, it seems. Yeah, can we get P up as a co-host too, Eli? Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me go ping Aaron really quick, and Gladstein, if you don't mind following up really. Oh, here's Aaron. If you don't mind following up really quickly with Adam, that'd be fantastic. P, I don't know if you want to do some shilling for the conference while we try to get settled in here, or not. I guess I could do it. That's fine too.
Sorry. I was going to say, yeah, man, we talk about it a lot, but this conference is going to be the best Bitcoin experience you could possibly have. It's going to be like a combination of the best thing that's ever happened in your life, and also Disneyland, and also Twitter Spaces / Clubhouse, all the best conversations. There's going to be stuff everywhere. It's going to be the kind of thing where even over 2 full GA days, you're not going to be able to see all of the amazing stuff that's going on. Lightning is going to be a major feature. Everything else that you'd expect is going to be there. Everyone you'd expect is going to be there. And if you want to buy a ticket, if you haven't already, first of all, shame on you. And then second of all, you can use the conference code HFSP for Have Fun Staying Poor, and that'll get you 10% off.
Okay, so Adam's coming in shortly. So Aaron, I figure maybe we can steer this conversation together and maybe rotate questions. But I think it's important for people listening to know that Aaron is basically a historian of early Bitcoin technology. And I've tried to do a little bit of that myself. And we're going to have here someone who is essentially one of the founding fathers of Bitcoin. You can think of it that way. And I think we got to start with the beginning, and Adam's here, so we'll get him up and we'll get going. Adam, welcome.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here. We have Aaron from Bitcoin Magazine, and I think Aaron and I will just start to steer a conversation with you, Adam, that takes us from the beginning to today. It's ambitious, but we really want to start at the beginning. Let's go back to the late 80s, early 90s to the beginnings of the crypto wars and the beginning days of the cypherpunks. Would love to hear, Adam, if you could just give the audience today some color as to what that was like and what was the big battle at the time and what intrigued you to start joining the list and contributing?
Yeah, what intrigued me to join the list, the Cypherpunks List, and get interested was the release of PGP, email encryption program, and you could use it to encrypt files as well. And the sort of change in the balance of power that brought about, that individuals could coordinate online and exchange messages that the establishment and the spy apparatus couldn't decrypt. And so that caused quite a lot of discussion about the gradual change in the balance of power. And I happen to be aware of the RSA encryption algorithm that PGP is, that's the main building block, is this public key cryptography technology that had been invented in late 70s, because a friend of mine who was doing a master's degree while I was doing a PhD was trying to implement it faster, because CPUs weren't as fast back then and RSA was CPU intensive. And so he was doing it on a distributed system, like a system with communication network and many cores. And so we were both working in distributed systems. My PhD was in distributed systems. And yeah, I thought that was a very interesting and intriguing kind of combination of positive societal value and mathematical cryptography, computer science. And so I went to see where people were talking about such things, find out where people were talking about that and further things you could build on it. And so I found the Cypherpunks List, and certainly people were interested in a lot of related things like disk encryption, anonymity, and privacy. So, Hal Finney, who's well known in Bitcoin circles, was already active. And at that time, there was a remailer technology that would provide you with anonymity to send emails or post on discussion lists, basically by sending your email through multiple hops. And it didn't have any encryption. So somebody who had the ability to read everything on the internet, or a lot of things on the internet, like the NSA and GCHQ and people like that would probably be able to tell where the message came from. And so Hal Finney implemented PGP encryption into that remailer technology so that it would be a lot harder People would be looking at messages, they would be encrypted, and then there was a kind of batching so that each remailer would receive, let's say, a batch of 20 or 50 mails, shuffle them and send them out again, so you wouldn't be able to tell which email in corresponds to which email out if you're watching it as a black box. And that technology improved over time to become Mixmaster, which is a way to standardize, to make fixed size message chunks so that you couldn't tell which message was which based on the size, which is the case of the original one.
Adam, it's interesting for us to reflect back on the fact that a lot of the contributors to what would later become the Bitcoin project started in the privacy space, and they were obsessed with privacy and intrigued by it. And I guess the background for the audience would be that cryptography used to be the domain of the military and of governments. And as you mentioned, in the late 70s, academics in various places, but especially at Stanford, came up with this idea of public key cryptography, which about a decade later was actually implemented in a way that made it easy for PC users to exchange private messages beyond the control of spy agencies. And as you mentioned, Hal Finney, who was essentially the first person to receive a Bitcoin transaction from Satoshi, was an early, I think the second PGP contributor technically. And you had a lot of people like yourself working in this space before it became about money. I don't know if Aaron wants to weigh in on that transition as well. Would love to just focus in on this a little bit, this kind of like provenance of the people who fought for digital cash and how meaningful it was that they started out as privacy sort of advocates.
One of the interesting tie-ins, one of the interesting tie-ins here is that Adam Back just met the remailer system, and one of the problems that the remailers were facing was at that time spam. So anyone who was operating a remailer was essentially doing it as a free service, but that free service was starting to be abused. So that's one of the reasons why the cypherpunks started to look into how do you make it so that running such a system, running a remailer is actually incentivized. So for that, you might need some sort of digital cash system and a postage scheme, right? So you're paying postage to whoever, a form of postage to whoever is running these servers. And that's at least one of the reasons why the cypherpunks started to think about that, including Adam very specifically, of course, with hashcash, which was meant to be an anti-spam system to counter exactly that sort of spam that the remailers were facing. But maybe Adam wants to expand on that.
Yeah, as you said, the remailers were kind of volunteer things, and it was not without legal risk. Sometimes people would send something threatening or obnoxious through the remailers, and the authorities would come to the exit remailer, the last one in the hop that would actually send the email, and try to push them to reveal the previous hop. And of course, they wouldn't know because there's no logs and it's encrypted and stuff like that. But, nevertheless, I think the EFF maybe ended up helping defend a couple of people in that position. But there were lots of them. And when one failed, another one took over. There were like 50 to 100 of them at various times. And I operated one for a while, which I rented a shell account from like a one-man ISP, basically, that was in Switzerland at a time when I was living in the UK. So I had some kind of jurisdictional complexity to it to make it more difficult to work your way back. And just figured that I would operate it until such time as there was a major issue, and then I would shut it down. And that would be most likely the end of it. And that's actually how it went, how it progressed. It ran for a few years, some years. And then the Swiss Federal Police turned up at the fellow whose mini ISP it was and demanded to know more. So he told me, and I switched the remailer off. And I don't think either of us heard any more about it. So we don't know what threatening email was sent, but it was shut down and it did its job for a number of years. And that was the remailer.ch was the domain. So I bought a Swiss domain for it as well. So go ahead.
I was just going to ask, Adam, before we get into your practical implementation of and thinking about how you would address this issue of spam with remailers and improving that, what was your kind of, can you give us insight into just the cultural moment? Like science fiction authors had started to write about eCash. You had David Chaum and his team out in Amsterdam around 1990 starting to work on Digicash. Was there an excitement among like privacy advocates about the idea of cash beyond the control of governments? And was that something that immediately interested you, or was that only something that came later for you?
Yeah, there were different kind of applied crypto and privacy enhancing technologies, as they were called, and there were conference series on that. And of course, the Cypherpunks List itself, which was like very applied. They'd be more interested in writing code than writing papers. And apart from like disk encryption, email encryption, anonymous messaging, pseudonymous messaging, so that you could receive a reply, like a replyable remailer. That was another piece of technology they built with various people on the Cypherpunks List. And steganography was another one, so that you could hide an encrypted message in an image and people wouldn't be able to tell that it was a message even without the keys. And electronic cache. And I think really electronic cache was the elusive one. It was the hardest thing to build. And it's very difficult to know how you would bootstrap it, because people had originally assumed that you would need a partnership or service from a bank to send money in, and then you would have kind of electronic cash tokens that you could transfer between users very anonymously, and then convert them in and out of fiat at some point in between. And so that was, people were very excited about building that, but it's a very difficult thing to build. And Digicash tried to commercialize that. They implemented the technology. The original technology dates back to a 1985 paper by David Chong called About Blind Signatures. It's quite elegant and simple piece of technology, but it started the sort of strongly private electronic cash, which could be both sender and receiver anonymous. But it was a centralized protocol. So it went through a central server that was your double spend database, and you really had to, there was no way to audit it. So you had to trust that central server to not create more coins than there were fiat in a bank account. And they operate a demo server. People tried to bootstrap a value, actually, because they said that there would be no more than 1 million of these currency units, and they would email you, somewhat like a Bitcoin faucet. You could email them and they'd send you a few coins. And they promised there'd be no more than 1 million. And
yeah, so to be clear, sorry for interrupting, but just to make it clear to the audience, this is basically another, they had the version that you just mentioned that essentially had to be backed. And then they also had this demo version, the
Right.
Cyberbox, which they just promised there will only be 1 million of this, but it basically had no value. I think that was their intention. It was just a demo thing, but they said there will only be 1 million.
We're talking about David Chom's Digicash company and the currencies that they were issuing in the early 90s.
So in fact, their thought was this is like a Bitcoin testnet, right? Don't place value on these, but you can play with them, and we'll only issue 1 million of them. I don't know why they thought of that, but it created a kind of scarcity concept. So a number of people on the Cypherpunks had a go at just selling things for them. We figured it's only, like, there weren't that many people involved, but it's only $1 million. So if we just treat them, only 1 million units, if we treat them as dollars as a starting point and just sell things for them, if enough of us do that, maybe it will bootstrap a value. So people had a go at doing that. And they had some T-shirts, which were actually about the export restrictions on encryption software. Had a kind of small implementation of RSA on the T-shirt, which is short enough that you could type it in. So it's a protest at the silliness of that export restriction from the US. And so I was selling those online anyway, so I figured I'll try selling them for these Digicash demo coins, and other people did similar things. And before we got very far in this kind of rogue, unauthorized experiment, the Digicash went bankrupt and the double spend database went offline. So now you wouldn't be able to tell if you wouldn't be able to prove to somebody else that your coin was valid or not, because the way you spend coins in this system is you send them to the other person and they check if they're valid by redepositing them on the server and getting a fresh coin. And so the server was gone. So, that was the end of that.
And if I'm not mistaken, when you eventually released the hashcash concept, which we'll get into, you mentioned at the time that Digicash type projects may run into trouble. And in the meantime, maybe this could spark some sort of parallel structure that could help in the meantime. And I think it's also worth noting that the creator of BitGold, Nick Szabo, he was also contributing to Digicash. So it seems like quite a few of you who ended up contributing to what later would become Bitcoin were intrigued by Digicash, but then saw the problem with the centralized mint. And then that was like the next great challenge. Is that sort of correct?
Yeah. So I think this demo server didn't have the banking connection, and then the fact that it was centralized and failed showed empirically to people that the single point of failure was a problem, and it wasn't going to be a very robust electronic cash system, even if they did get a banking service that wasn't a demo server but was real dollars or something. So that started people thinking about whether you'd be able to distribute the double spend database. And so I think I'm not quite sure of the sequence, but in any case, I was operating this remailer, and this is how I came about with hashcash, and then these kind of distributed versions of hashcash as design concepts came about in the next year after that. So in 97, I was operating a remailer, and dozens of other people were operating similar remailers, and there was some kind of systematic spam, which was not commercial spam, like not trying to sell Viagra pills or things like that, with incredibly low success rate, but emails essentially free. But these were just nuisance spam. Like it would just be random numbers and sent to Usenet, which is a very distributed broadcast chat system that's still around, but less popular. And so it magnified the denial of service. They could send some random numbers through Remailer would send it to Usenet. Usenet would broadcast it to thousands and thousands of sites around the world. And then the system administrators of those sites would get annoyed about the spam. And I suppose the people doing it wanted to create a backlash against privacy. Like they were hostile to privacy. This was our operating theory, that this spam was trying to discredit remailers and create a system administrator backlash so that they would try to block the remailers as the exit points as senders to Usenet or something like that. It caused me to think about normally at that time, and still anti-spam is done by just blocking IP addresses, senders. And of course, you can't do that with an anonymous system because the whole point is you don't know who the sender is by design. So it caused me to think about it in a different way, which is, what's the real problem? The real problem is it's free. So it's a pity that Digicash didn't make it. And credit card processing was difficult and centralized, and not everybody has one. And so
and there was one more problem, if I can jump in real quick, because I want to ask if you remember this. So you mentioned the problem of centralization of Digicash. There was another problem, which was that it was patented. And this was a huge source of frustration for the cypherpunks, including yourself. I've read messages of you where, because the cypherpunks had this idea that you have this really cool technology, and the way to improve this and the way to actually make this work is to let people experiment with it and let people figure out how to make it work better. But that was actually blocked off by these patents. At one point, you grew so frustrated that you offered on the Cypherpunk list, let's just buy this patent stand. Do you remember this?
I'd forgotten that, but it was definitely a point of contention, and there was a kind of party when patent expired. And it was the first kind of electronic cash patent to expire because it was so early. Presumably that was filed sometime after 1985. So around 2000.
I think even earlier, Adam. I think the original paper was like 1980.
Could be the blind signature paper.
The paper that references Big Brother, I'm not sure. He had a couple, of course, but I think the earliest digital cash proposal by Chalm was 1980.
You're right. Here we go. 1983, blind signatures for untraceable payment. There you go. Yeah. So I guess after the 20 years or whatever the rule was, like the patent associated with that, which presumably was granted sometime after it expired, and there was a party for the expiry of it. But before that time, people were trying to think of different ways of achieving the same result. There was another actually better scheme by another cryptographer who was actually David Chom's PhD student, a friend of mine, Stefan Brands. So he developed a discrete log way of doing the same thing, which was more flexible, powerful. But unfortunately, he also patented it. And so, yeah, I think part of the problem with patents is that for internet protocols, the IETF, like Internet Engineering Task Force, likes to have royalty-free and patent technology because it presents a barrier to adoption. And so I think it's actually counterproductive to patent something. Their argument for patenting it is, well, they can use it to present to investors to raise money to commercialize and build the technology, but it tends to do the opposite, which is after Digicash went bankrupt, it was bought by a large company and put in a big patent portfolio and never used until it expired. But that was the end of that.
But before we get deeper into what the next eCash projects were, when we spoke, you talked a lot about how you were maybe disenchanted by the mainstream approach to fighting the surveillance state, which started to emerge in the 80s, which said that maybe we should just ask governments to stop it. And you basically said there's this other option, which is we could just seize our rights with code. Could you talk a little bit about that strategy and how the cypherpunks basically took a different line than others who were also concerned with the surveillance state at the time, and just the two different strategies of lobbying the government and trying to work to make better public money or better public communications versus creating open source alternatives.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, you would actually have right in legal sense, legal and regulatory sense, but they were being ignored or eroded online. And the other thing is, when you want to improve the balance of power for the individual, if you ask for permission from the establishment, the answer is going to be no. And so you get mission creep from establishment and government and regulators, and it has its own inertia. And typically, the way that things work out in practice is society reaches a new norm, and the archaic laws say it's illegal to do things that 90% of the population are doing, and eventually there's an egregious test case and they overturn it. But there are various people victimized by these kind of archaic laws in the meantime. And so you can view the legal landscape as a trailing indicator of society's views, and it almost never leads. So that, from that perspective, to get to effect change, it seems like society's led by adoption, innovation, and just doing things becoming popular, and eventually the laws will catch up, and the regulations will catch up. On the one hand, a lot of these things, the rights of freedom of association, freedom of speech and things are enshrined in laws and regulations in many countries, but nevertheless the online trend was actually depriving you of those. And the way to assert them is to protect them with cryptography. And so that's what the cypherpunks were about. And certainly this concept of just building it and don't ask permission was something that Tim May and John Gilmour, who were some of the Cypherpunks co-founders, and Eric Hughes wrote about. Eric Hughes wrote a Cypherpunks manifesto, and I think it says something pretty much explicit along these lines, like, we don't care what you think we're going to build and do, or something like that, paraphrase. So yeah, that's that direction. You can see a more modern version of that. Well, it's old news now, but when Skype first started doing online audio and video voice over IP things, the telecom regulators and the telecom companies, many of which are government owned, hated it because it was going to erode their long distance, the egregiously expensive long distance calling plans. And so they lobbied against it. And Skype didn't try to become a telephony provider and get all the licenses internationally. They just built the app and went for it, and dealt with the legal attacks behind Perfect. And that just became too popular to stop. And so the online use of voice things, effectively, such as we're doing now, kind of effectively were able to bypass a lot of restrictive telephony rules.
What was it like to watch the gradual concession, essentially, or defeat of the U.S. government and the Clinton administration with regard to the Clipper chip and basically its plans to try and penalize or criminalize citizen cryptography over the decade, over the 90s? What was it like to be a part of that and watch that?
Yeah, it was interesting because in principle, the restrictions seemed laughably pointless, because de facto, everybody had all the encryption software they want, and the internet has no borders. And as John Gilmour had observed, actually one of the Cypherpunk co-founders, the internet views censorship as damage and routes around it. So that's a famous quote that he had said at some point. And so de facto, people were using encryption software and encryption libraries, and some of it was written internationally, not in the US. And so it seemed frustratingly stupid, but I think the pragmatic kind of what the US sort of national security apparatus, like NSA and their counterparts in other countries, in some countries there were also restrictions, mostly not, was actually to impede the adoption of encryption. So they knew that it wouldn't stop it because the internet's porous, but they figured that it would be harder to interoperate and harder for companies to make encryption-related software available for download, and it would just slow adoption. And more encrypted things was less control. So that's why. But it became an impediment to finance, basically. And so eventually it was overturned because enough companies lobbied. And the US has a strong kind of free speech and anti-censorship for printed books. And for example, some people have printed the PGP source code in some thick books that some people in Europe scanned. There wasn't really much they could do about it because they couldn't quite bring themselves to ban a book. That would have been difficult politically. So it made a bit of a mockery of the whole situation until they gave up.
So would you say that to whatever extent the U.S. has a free society, relatively speaking, that made a difference then in terms of the courts, the judges vis-a-vis had this happened in China or some other country? Like that maybe that did matter.
I mean, it was certainly a correlation between the sort of civil rights records, independence of courts, and the sort of freedom metric, kind of metrics for countries being civilized places to live in, where you have rights and you can rely on courts. So countries on the worst end of that would be the ones that would have in place a ban on encryption. And some anomalies, like France had one, the US had one, and other places in Europe didn't. So I think it seemed like the strong precedent for not censoring written and spoken speech in the US helped, because people basically they blurred the line between software and speech by printing it in books, in my case, putting it on a t-shirt. And there are a few people who got a tattoo of that program as well, because it was like 3 lines of space optimized Perl code, basically. The point was to make it as small as possible to show how silly it was that this could be restricted.
Aaron,
Good.
I'm just going to ask Aaron, is there anything else you wanted to hit on the crypto wars before we move on to other digital cash projects?
No, let's move on.
Yo, what is going on, plebs? We're going to take a break from our programming to tell you about the resurrection of our print magazine, starting with the El Salvador issue. Starting this fall, Bitcoin Magazine will be available on newsstands nationwide and at retail stores such as Barnes and Noble. Don't want to get off your couch, though? No problem. You can also go to store.bitcoinmagazine.com. So skip the line and get each issue shipped directly to your front door with our annual subscription. I'm talking 4 issues a year that contain exclusive interviews and profiles with leading Bitcoiners, actionable insights on the state of the market, breaking news and cultural trends, along with powerful photos and artwork from the best artists in the world. Subscribe today and get 21% off using code podcast at checkout. That's PODCAST podcast at checkout.
All right. So Adam, we have this decade between the failure of Digicash and creation of Bitcoin, or a little more than a decade. And obviously you were continuing to work on digital cash projects. You kept looking at your own hashcash design. We had Wei Dai, we had Nick Szabo, and then we had Hal Finney all come out with interesting new concepts. But there was still this, again, decade plus gap. Can you talk to us a little bit about this gap and what was happening there and what you were up to on the digital cash front, let's say from the late 90s till you got that email from Satoshi?
I would say that hashcash itself was a kind of stopgap because it wasn't respendable, but it did impose a cost. So it had a kind of metering benefit, and it was anonymous because you could just mine them yourself. Like freshly mined Bitcoins are anonymous, hashcash stamps were anonymous, and it was very scalable and distributed because the double spend databases are tiny ones on the recipients, so it fully scaled. But it was interesting that it seemed like multiple people recognized almost immediately that hashcash could be an interesting ingredient in trying to solve in trying to decentralize electronic cash system like Digicash. Like that, people were commenting like within the next day, that looks like digital gold. It's got some scarcity. There's a cost associated to making it, and yet it's electronic. That started a multi-year conversation about how to, on the Cypherpunks list mostly, about how to control inflation in it. People were worried that if you built a system that was based on it, that as computers get faster, you'd get hyperinflation. And that people struggled with how Bitcoin solves this is with a difficulty adjustment, but nobody figured that out at the time. And by the next year, so that was 97, by 98, there were 2 proposals one by Wei Dai called B-Money and one by Nick Szabo called BitGold, which were sort of candidate solutions for this, which were somewhat decentralized, but lacking enough detail to implement and involving some human or market judgment. So B-Money had basically supernodes. So people would run servers and vote amongst themselves how many coins would be mined or the cost of mining coins in the next month or something like that. And Nick Szabo had the other idea, which was just you make stamps and let people make them as fast as they want. And if a lot are made in a month, those are not rare. And if few are made, they're rare. And then you assemble a standardized bundle of stamps and that becomes a coin. It's standardized by kind of total scarcity of it or something. So he envisaged a collectible market, like physical stamp collectors. They can make a there are people that specialize in making a fixed value book out of a mixture of scarce and non-scarce stamps. So it's complicated and indirect, and also in the B-Money case, in both cases, hard for a piece of software to automate that. That involves human judgment in both cases. In my mind, that's what one of the key things that Bitcoin solved, because if you look at the B-Money and BitGold discussions, particularly Nick Szabo had written about a lot of related things. He'd actually originated the idea of smart contracts like 5 years before hashcash, or 3 years, something like that. And he talks about, distributing the database, Byzantine generals problem, like the coordination problem, and using hashcash to create the stamps, and B-Money uses hashcash to create stamps. So they basically, the realization was, as Waydai put it, you could have an electronic cash system without a banking interface if you could mine the coins into existence. And all of these systems, B-Money, BitGold, and Hal Finney's RPow, used proof of work to mine coins. So I think the sort of 98 to 2004, actually, I did continue to try to find solutions to a lot of these things. In my spare time, I actually worked for Zero Knowledge Systems in Canada from 99 to 2001. And they had licensed the Stefan Brand's electronic cash system, which is another very private electronic cash system. They made an implementation, and I tried to find a way. There's also a central server model. I tried to find a way to make that offline respendable. And it turned out that the idea I hit on was actually already discovered by somebody else. I described it to Stefan Brands, and he said, "Oh yeah, there's a footnote in this page of his thesis that describes it." So at least I found something, but that was still like a reactive security model and relied ultimately on a central server. So Hal Finney's, basically it was hard and nobody found a solution. And then Hal Finney in 2004 made use of a new technology, which is the trustworthy computing. A lot of people weren't very keen on trustworthy computing because it meant that there was a kind of hypervisor in your CPU or connected to your CPU that could run code that you couldn't inspect or modify. So it was intrusive in a way and controlling, like you couldn't fully program and control your machine anymore. But Hal Finney found a way to use it to security advantage, because you could make this thing called a remote attestation, which would prove to a third party what software was running in this hypervisor. And that would allow you to trust it, assuming that the hardware vendor hadn't colluded with a server operator to, extract the keys from the hardware. And the hardware generated its own keys, a little HSM-like device. So he bought one of these things and implemented RPow. So basically, he built a CHORM electronic cash server where the way you would pay for coins was not with fiat, but by sending it hashcash stamps, and then it would send you a CHORM coin, and you could respend the CHORM coin by giving it to somebody else who would check if it's valid against the server that he ran. And it interestingly indirectly solved the inflation trust for the server, because you could be sure that the server wouldn't create more coins than work was done, because you could audit the code and the code would prevent that. So that was interesting innovation, but unfortunately it also has the centralization.
Aaron, do you want to you've explored and written a lot about this time and these innovations. Do you want to color in some context for the audience on these kind of successive innovations that built on each other?
Let's see. One thing about RPow that's interesting, it didn't solve the inflation problem that was mentioned. I think that was something that Hal Finney at that time just skipped over. So you have the double spend inflation in a way. If you double spend, you're creating more coins. And then you have the other type of inflation, which Adam mentioned, which is computers get faster over time. Hal didn't solve the second. So he maybe that was a longer term plan for him, but that was still a weak spot in RPow.
Yeah.
No, I think Adam gave a very good overview. I'm not sure what else to add to that.
I guess what I want to get at here is that you start to see this concept of scarcity come in, and there's been this tension between like privacy and scarcity always, not just technologically and from an engineering trade-off perspective, but also culturally, because it seems like even today, a lot of the privacy community is like hostile to the scarcity component of Bitcoin, which is going from 2004 to 2008, Adam, we have Satoshi reaching out to you, not after a surveillance scandal, but in the middle of the great financial crisis. And indeed, a few months later, when he or whoever it was launched the actual software in the Genesis block, there's a critique of sort of central banking in there. Could you talk a little bit about how Bitcoin merged these two kind of ideas or communities together, Adam?
Yeah. So I think actually that maybe Hal Finney and Nick Szabo were a bit interested in hard money, like gold, and had some interest in a return to a gold standard, that kind of thing. But most of the electronic cash systems were just assuming previously that you would connect it to a fiat with a bank. Doing the proof of work to get into it, it does create the opportunity that there can be independent scarcity. Like the system can run under its own steam, and it can create scarcity controlling the supply curve, and that's what Bitcoin does. So if you make that leap, which nobody did before Satoshi, that you could just control the supply curve of the rate of production of new coins, and a distributed system could do that all by itself without reference to human concepts. What is a dollar? What's the price? That kind of thing. That can be all outside the system, and so then it can be all automated. But then you just see what the market does, right? The market will adapt, and that will indirectly control the amount of work that's done, but it won't vary the amount of coins that are created. So those are very interesting concepts. I think that certainly Bitcoin was novel and different to the previous systems in the way that it uses proof of work to solve the sort of race condition tiebreaker of the Byzantine generals problem. Basically that people could be, it's a distributed system, there's no one in charge, it's not even clear what is accurate time, what time is it right now, that's not clear, people could lie. And yet you have to coordinate which set of transactions gets processed and ensure that nothing gets undone and redone. And the way Bitcoin uses proof of to address that was like all new. But Bitcoin has a lot less privacy than the previous electronic cash systems, and the security model took getting used to for academic cryptographers. So I would say the first few years of Bitcoin's interaction with academic, like mathematical cryptographers, was rough. They thought it was not very good. Like they thought it wasn't very private, and it did, because there was a kind of idealized mathematical set of assumptions about how an electronic cash system should look. And there have been dozens of incremental improvements over the years that included the visibility of coins and always the same kind of privacy assumption that Schwarm and Brands had. Bitcoin didn't have any of that. There was, each coin is like a pseudonym, so you can link the history of coins a bit without names attached, but it didn't have this kind of unlinkable payment privacy. And the security assumption was also a little different. Like you could, looking at it from that time period, people would assume that it's pitting the good guys against the bad guys, and if the bad guys had more money or more hash rate, they could overwhelm the system and undo transactions and steal things, stuff like that. So it took people a while to get used to that kind of balance of things. But, and of course, for Bitcoin itself to have a market price at all. Like I think the first few years, there was no price, right? Just people doing it as a hobby for amusement and a bootstrap event somewhere along there.
So I think we'll dive more into the kind of goal of trying to make Bitcoin more private. But first, I would be remiss for us to not ask you to reflect on the day you got this email from this person. You ended up a few months later being one of the 8 citations in the Bitcoin white paper. So obviously this person thought what you had to say was useful. What can you just walk us through what it was like to get this email, and did you initially ignore it or downplay it, or were you like, this is really interesting?
So I'm pretty sure that the design and most of the implementation was probably already done at that point. The paper was there. From time to time, people will say that such and such person helped Satoshi, but it seemed like, as far as I know, I'm the first person to get an email, and he'd already built it. He did it by himself. And as far as anybody knows, it was one person. So I wouldn't lay claim to having influenced the design because the design was already built. But what he did cite was hashcash, and Bitcoin uses that as the proof of work mechanism and as the kind of type, as a way to finalize and cement transactions under large amounts of work. So sort of to create a finality guarantee and distributed system and a race condition tiebreaker for things that happen by accident at the same time. And so the email thread was really just talked about this online. And so there's a guy called Gwern who has a blog, and he's collected some of the emails from Wei Dai and other people from that time. But basically he was trying to cite things. And so he wanted to know how he should cite hashcash and if I had any comments on the paper, which he linked. And so I read it enough to realize that it seemed pretty related to B-Money and didn't mention B-Money. And I was aware of BitGold, but I think B-Money was published somewhere where I was more active. So I remembered that one first. So I mentioned that he might want to look at B-Money because it's related. And so I think that is what caused Satoshi to add the B-Money citation to the paper. And Wei Dai has published his email, so it seemed like he turned around and emailed Wei Dai immediately and asked him for a citation for B-Money. And B-Money it's not like a paper or something. It's like a text, one-page web page, like a kind of blog entry or something. It's a very interesting idea, but it wasn't like formally published. So I think it just referred to the URL. But in terms of getting an email, I think it didn't occur to me that Satoshi was a pseudonym, that wasn't a real name. Well, it wasn't a real name of a person. And if you have open source software or applied crypto papers or observations online, you get like emails from once every month or two from somebody who's got a question about something you did or is using something and wants you to make you aware of it so that you might find it interesting to look at it. So it just felt like that to me. But I think my view on Bitcoin was that, like other people doing, I was more of an applied person, but like the academic authors, I read many of the academic papers on this electronic cash topic and implemented some of the protocols in the past. That, wow, it's not very private, is it? And then you've got this good guys versus bad guys hash rate, but because of the Digicash experience, it did seem to me that it had one strong advantage, which is it's decentralized, and so it should be more survivable. And so it would be interesting to see if it would bootstrap. That's where I got to.
You said something interesting to me where you said that there was a paper that came out in 99 that built on some of the kind of zero knowledge digital cash experiments. And you said, actually, in retrospect, you're glad you didn't mention this to Satoshi because by trying to use this privacy technology, it makes transactions much larger, and it would have hurt the ability for Bitcoin to be as decentralized as it is. Do you want to just address also this ongoing tension between the size of transactions, privacy, and how Bitcoin would ultimately be a system that users could control by running a node at home?
Yeah, actually, I sent the Bitcoin system in early 2009 to some former colleagues who were applied crypto people. So this is interesting, you should have a look at it, kind of thing. And a few of them, for my trouble, accused me of being Satoshi. So I said no, because if I would have done it, I would have used this paper because it has a privacy solution that still works in a distributed system. Like most of the previous electronic cash systems, the cryptography would only work on a single server because you'd need the private key to operate it. But this particular system, it's a Sandra Tashma auditable electronic cash, anonymous auditable electronic cash. It has no keys. It's just a kind of using zero knowledge proofs and of set membership and things like that. And so it could be used in a distributed system. Instead of having a central bulletin board, you can just broadcast it. So it immediately occurred to me that, wow, Bitcoin could have used that and it wouldn't have such bad privacy. And so I guess that occurred to me later, like in early 2009. And curiously, other people made that connection later. So there's a paper called Zero Coin by Matthew Green and others. And some of the altcoins today picked up the technology and used it, and some other academics made more efficient versions of it. So they're actually optimizations of that paper indirectly. But for myself, I would certainly like to see Bitcoin. It's just technically difficult. So to find a way to make a scalable and very private solution, like David Schwann's original protocol, but in a decentralized way. The problem is the crypto is like CPU heavy and makes large proofs that maybe have log scaling, like they get bigger the more coins there are. And the systems which are able to achieve a lot more compact proofs are using very novel new crypto, and it's greater risk that they end up being proven to be incorrect and have a defect and lose all the money or suffer unresolvable inflation or something like that. So it's at the bleeding edge of what's possible at the moment. But yeah,
but this tension is why you essentially part of why you created Blockstream and why you got back into Bitcoin is you were like, I want to find a way to make it more private, right?
Yeah. I was working in another startup of early 2009 onwards, from before then, but up until 2013, and I got very interested in Bitcoin in 2013 and did the usual thing that people do, go down the rabbit hole and realize there's a lot more to this than what I had seen in the original paper. And it like clearly bootstrapped at that point, so it was going somewhere. And so I, tried to read everything there was to try to understand the details. And there wasn't much written at that time, so I ended up finding the Bitcoin Wizards IRC and just peppering them with questions, and they were very helpful. So that enabled me to catch up with more than was written down and look at the source code and things. And what I was interested to do, so, okay, it looks like it's bootstrapped. There's really not very much privacy, but this is my background, right? I've implemented electronic cash papers. I'm very familiar with privacy enhanced technology, electronic cash protocols. So I'm like, well, surely there's some way to improve it after the fact, like retroactively fit unlinkable privacy or some forms of confidentiality into it. And so I found a way to do what later became known as confidential transactions. And that doesn't hide the history, but it hides the value, which makes it a lot easier to do coin join because you don't have to make the amount standard. And this makes it ambiguous what's changed and what's not. So it's really an interesting incremental privacy improvement without somewhat helps the linkability, but definitely helps hide values. And so I thought this would be interesting and try to explore with people closer to the implementation and working on improvements, what it would take to integrate it in Bitcoin. And it became apparent that they were dealing with complexity and security first, and it'd be difficult to get something as large as that into Bitcoin in a fast time frame. So that caused me to, instead of giving up, to try and change topics to try and find a way to make Bitcoin more modular. The Linux kernel has modules where you can write kernel modules that extend the core functionality. Like many systems have layers of modules where you can do extensions. So I figured then that it would be very useful for Bitcoin to have a way to do modular extensions. And that's where the sidechain concept came from, and indirectly Blockstream, because I wanted to build that. And it's quite a large undertaking. So I needed to recruit some very technical people and all kinds of skill sets for people to build wallets, software and hardware, do applied crypto, do user interface, do the whole thing. So that's where Blockstream.
Yeah, just one more question for me. Would love to hear from Aaron on this. So your quest continues. Obviously, Blockstream is contributing to a sidechain that has CT on it. You've got Lightning that you're building and you're contributing to. So obviously, it seems like from a corporate perspective, you personally want to see Bitcoin more private, which is great. But how would you compare what's happening now with let's say we'll call it the digital currency kind of war versus the crypto war of the early 90s? What, just in terms of cultural feel, is there some deja vu? How would you compare yourself mentally back then to now? And obviously because of the money aspect, the fight is so much bigger. It touches so many more people, but would love to hear you compare the two eras.
Yeah, there's definitely some transferable learnings. So as part of PGP and even hashcash, I ended up talking with journalists who write for Wired magazine or different kind of technical magazines, which there were some online, some in paper form. And in discussing a topic with some establishment viewpoints that maybe pervade even mainstream journalism, it's you've got to be careful what you say or you get misquoted. So you learn to say exactly what you want to be quoted on and nothing else, and not fall for the traps. Couldn't it be used for this bad act? Or technology is neutral, actually improves individual safety, that kind of thing. So you've got to think about how to communicate about things when the world at large is a little bit hostile or skeptical.
Meaning back then they said, the Clinton administration and the media were saying, oh, privacy tech and PGP will be used by criminals and pedophiles and terrorists and that sort of thing. And now you're seeing the same thing again with Bitcoin, right?
Yeah. It's very reminiscent. People even called it the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is the terrorists and so on. And it's just
money launderers.
Yeah, it's just a standard refrain of a catalog of hypothetical bad uses therefore any new technology must be bad. Like the internet must be bad, encryption must be bad. Having privacy online, you can have privacy in person, but you can't. But they want to fight you having it online. And so they just use these kind of argumentation fallacy traps. And so, yeah, it was useful to learn how to do that, how to talk with journalists and not get tripped up.
I think one of the interesting lessons from that era is maybe also that the crypto wars, like the cypherpunks were fighting the crypto wars, but it was not just the cypherpunks. It was really a multi-faceted type of war, whatever you want to call it, where the cypherpunks, Tim May described the cypherpunks as the radical arm of that, like the Black Panthers arm of the crypto wars. But it was not just the cypherpunks; it was also like human rights groups, and at some point it was also just Silicon Valley. Like Netscape had their encryption broken. That was actually after a contest that was organized by Hal Finney, and then Netscape had their encryption broken, their export secure encryption, and then Silicon Valley made the argument, Netscape made the argument that it was hurting their business. So now you had all these different factions, the more radical cypherpunks, and then the human rights groups, and the commercial enterprises, and it's because they were all fighting for the same cause that they ultimately won, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting for example, when we started Blockstream, the regulations were far less clear, and so it felt like a non-trivial risk that a major government could try to just blanket ban it. And it seems like Bitcoin has somehow navigated through that, grown organically over time, and possibly, and at that time, no banks wanted to talk about Bitcoin or blockchain, and that changed within a few years. Every bank had a blockchain R&D group, and so that probably added some kind of establishment acceptance of the innovation, like it's a new internet technology marvel, and it arises from Bitcoin. And today, of course, there are many financial institutions that have come around, and it's Bitcoin, not blockchain, and they have. We just had the first Bitcoin ETF in the US. Just a few days ago. So it's turned around. And so I think the risk of regulatory fallout significantly impacting Bitcoin is receding. But certainly in the 2013 era, that was far less clear. It was just undefined, right?
Pete, you're with us now. Do you want to chime in? And
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, funny you guys are talking about this. I'm actually curious to pick Adam's brain a little bit. Yeah, I was thinking about this today. I remember that Blockstream was doing a lot of work back in the day with firms like PwC and banks and financial institutions, and you guys were doing some work with private blockchains. So I guess I'm just wondering what kind of insights you have there. Did we learn anything from that blockchain, not Bitcoin period? And then I guess how have those conversations changed? Could you maybe speak a little bit about that? Because I feel like it's changed significantly, but maybe we don't hear about that.
Yeah, actually, we decided to not. There were banks that would be interested to engage technology companies to help with technology for pilot projects. And we just could foresee that probably wasn't going to go anywhere, and it would consume your focus and resources. So we ended up not doing any of those. And the other thing with the private blockchains is I think much of the value of non-Bitcoin applications of blockchain is a public audit. So if the blockchain is private, it's not really clear to me that it's delivering much value to the end users. And so therefore it's not much different to the organizations either. It's just a different database and its value gets lost. So we tried to make the argument that you could have confidentiality in a blockchain that was public and not needed to be private. You could use the internet analogy that originally people were talking about intranets, right? So a VPN firewalled off private little enclave of the internet with company internal information in it, and they were scared to connect to the internet proper. And eventually they gave up on that and just realized, well, you can use the internet, and if you need to encrypt something, you can encrypt it. And if you need to access the office computers, you can use a VPN. And so we would draw the analogy that because of confidential transactions, Liquid as a Bitcoin sidechain it's like a VPN, right? Or you have the confidentiality, so you don't need it to be a private blockchain. So you have all the encryption and access controls to get the confidentiality you're after without losing the audit capability. I think the other thing is that you need blockchains to interoperate and for people to be able to transact with each other and build smart contracts out of other companies and individual developers, building blocks and contracts and financial instruments. And that's going to be very difficult if each organization is running their own private blockchain. They won't connect. So open networks tend to win. And the other thing you said, Peter, is the turnaround. So it became Bitcoin, not blockchain. That apart from those kind of other uses like security tokens, I think is where that's been heading lately, which is like pretty interesting. The thing that turned it around is just the size of the markets. The crypto exchange market has grown by orders of magnitude to the point that the volume on them is bigger than some national stock exchanges. That and the wider investor demand basically pushed financial institutions to offer Bitcoin financial products like Bitcoin futures and Bitcoin ETFs and exposure to investors of custody, Bitcoin in custody or closed trusts and things like that. So I think that is what brought them around, that there was a financial opportunity they were losing out on by not participating.
I guess the other part of that question was really just, have they really changed their mind about it? Right? I know that they're offering trading products, but it seemed like during that era they were trying to compete against it directly. And have they really stopped doing that, or is it something else has happened?
I think the general security token model doesn't have a competitive token. It's just a kind of open network back office contracting method. If somebody's today on existing financial infrastructure, they're going to issue a financial product and there's going to be a back office, like some databases and servers that are going to evaluate options and exercise them if needed or execute different things autonomously. And that becomes possible to use on an open network. So that's one thing. But I think, certainly some of them are skeptical and say so, but are offering it because their customers demand it. And if they don't provide it, their customers go to another financial provider, get exposure to it. And you see some financial institutions talking about it in those terms. But there have also been, over time, some quite well-known macro investors who have taken like large direct Bitcoin positions themselves and have spoken positively about it. So it seems to be converting people over time. And of course, the kind of financial situation since COVID has probably taken us back to the Bitcoin Genesis quote, sort of moral hazard and runaway quantitative easing, QE infinity, all that stuff, which causes people to think a lot more about inflation and an inflation hedge. So I think that has, helped people see Bitcoin as an alternative to gold and probably sucked some value away from gold into Bitcoin as a more modern replacement.
Yeah, Pete, can we get you to talk about, given your extensive reporting on the Satoshi's early days, or rather the only days that we know of, this tension between what Adam was just discussing, the fact that it was created during the great financial crisis and it relates to a desire to quote unquote fix central banking in a way versus the privacy component of the cypherpunk kind of spirit? Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, sure. I can riff off that. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, my takeaway from looking at that time is I think Satoshi definitely thought that Bitcoin was anonymous, that he had achieved anonymous payments. You can look at his early writings and then the early Bitcoin.org website, right, where he lists some primary value propositions. And I think while he does see it as an alternative to central banking, I think there's at least a couple old kind of website clips where he just says straight up, yeah, this is anonymous payments. It's like are possible. And obviously what we see over time is that got walked back a bit. So yeah, I'm still interested. And I guess speaking of that early period, that seems like it's still part of the dream of Bitcoin, right? Of trying to achieve robust financial system in the way that Satoshi envisioned it as something that would, compete against that level. I think Satoshi's tough though too, because he's not super expressive. We don't have a ton of insight into his thinking. It's like he's very deliberate. So to the extent that we can like catch some of these little glimpses of things, I'd be curious to get Adam's thoughts on just Satoshi's attitude towards privacy, because I don't even know to the extent that his perception on his own creation changes. Like we don't really have that insight. So it's tough when you're looking at the old logs for Satoshi, because you can get glimpses of things, because you can see that he took action, so that he wrote words that saying that he thought Bitcoin was private. Obviously that's not in the white paper, so maybe that occurred to him later, or maybe that was something else. Maybe there was multiple people working on it who just disagreed. So you can only really draw so many inferences. And I guess my takeaway on the privacy in the original part is obviously not really there in the white paper. It seems to be there in the initial discussions when he starts circulating it. And then later on, there's a scrubbing and a moving away from that, where that language just changes. There's no declaration or email list from Satoshi where he says, hey, these things aren't private anymore. It just seems like that's a gradual realization. I don't know if Adam has any more insight from his readings of those logs, but my takeaway is it seems to be more of a private realization that didn't happen. And yeah, certainly something that I wish we had more about.
And you're right that it didn't seem that in 2013, I went through and read the backlog on a Bitcoin Talk forum, and there really wasn't much in the way of technical motivation, like explaining the design considerations or design alternatives. It's just here's the source code and here's the paper and here's how it works, not what it was trying to solve or alternatives discarded or sparse information. And so it's similar about the use case motivations, but I think probably the Genesis quote is pretty political in nature, right? That it's like about a reform of monetary base almost, right? Which was actually, I would say, was something that some people had thought about, but not everybody. Other people were thinking about more about, like in previous electronic atoms, were thinking more about just the privacy angle, not that it would, be a reform for separate money from state, just that you would be able to use fiat money anonymously in electronic form or something like that. So by combining those two things, I think Bitcoin benefits a great deal because in the time that it was released and now there's a lot of concern about inflation and management of fiat currencies. And the fact that it has a floating value created an adoption incentive. So I think people get interested in, they get exposed to Bitcoin for a lot of different reasons, but one of them is as an investment. And then they learn more about it, like philosophically, and become attracted to it for more philosophical reasons over time. So I've got to assume that accelerated the adoption a lot compared to something just that was effectively like a stable coin, which was a concept of the other systems. So
yeah, or worse than a stable coin, like RPow, for example. RPow worked. It did offer the privacy benefits that Helvini and the other privacy advocates and cypherpunks were looking for. However, it had this big problem that it didn't hold value very well. And if it doesn't hold value well, then they're not very excited to accept it. And if people are not very excited to accept it, then no one's accepting it and you can't spend it anywhere. So now you have private money, but you can't spend it anywhere. So that's one of the things that Bitcoin very cleverly did. So on the one hand, of course, you have the money reformers and the gold bugs that really like this limited supply. But on the other hand, the privacy should also like this limited supply because now at least works. At least there's an incentive for people to accept it. Even if that's not their primary concern, at least this economic incentive makes that it's being adopted. And now you can actually use this money, which is fairly private at least, and hopefully more private in the future.
Yeah, I think the privacy is incrementally improving over time as well. Each major release of Bitcoin usually has some kind of incremental privacy improvement in the networking, or like the Taproot proposal just now activated has some anti-fingerprinting, basically, that different types of transactions look the same, whether they're a Lightning channel or a single signature or a multi-signature. In most cases, they look indistinguishable. And that helps because one of the ways that somebody would analyze a blockchain is to try and categorize types of transactions and cluster them, and then analyze within that. So they could identify, oh, that's a Lightning channel, that's a green wallet with its multi-sig type, which is distinct and stuff like that. So it can potentially solve many of those things once adopted widely.
Adam, we got a couple of questions that people reached out to me. They want to maybe hear your take on, you spent a lot of your personal time and energy, and obviously your colleagues at Blockstream, on during this sort of block size war on trying to make sure to keep the blockchain in a state where the average person could run it at home. Why did you all spend so much time and energy on this? And can you give us some reflections on that period in Bitcoin history?
Yeah, actually, the Blockstream as a company tried to not have an official position. And the views of individual people who worked on protocols or implementations varied a bit. There were a couple of people that thought big blocks would be good, or somewhere in between would be good, and other people that thought too large would be bad. And I think some people's views changed over the years as well. They thought large blocks would be okay, and then they came to realize that would actually be a problem. And I think there's a couple of things. So one kind of generic argument is that if you look at Bitcoin's differentiator, what makes it unique and different from other systems is that it is permissionless and auditable. And if it becomes too big and heavy so that it can only be run by a business on $1 million of hosting per year or something, and nobody can verify it, then it's going to be subject to corporate interpretations. So you've got to stay away from that extreme, or it will fail in a centralization sense. So I think that was the concern to like the key differentiator for Bitcoin. I think people have different views about what Bitcoin is, but it seems to me, and evidently to the majority of the market, given what happened after the forks, Bitcoin rapidly became the dominant financial outcome of it, is that the differentiator is that it's permissionless and that arises from the decentralization, basically. And if you try to scale it in a crude way, that will inevitably get eroded. So that was one factor. Another factor is that networking it sounds simple, but in practice, it's an area of computer science that is a specialized area. And most network theory and most networks in practice, the internet, GSM networks, 3G, 4G networks, they have some common patterns, which is that you don't broadcast everything because broadcast doesn't scale very well. They have switch networking and not broadcast networking. And so it's pretty obvious to anybody with any networking experience that what you want to do is use the Bitcoin kind of base layer as the censorship resistant, very survivable and robust, secure core. And then you want to build switch networks on top. And obviously, like Lightning is a switch network. And it's much easier to scale switch networks because not everybody has to see all the traffic. So that's another thing. And the final thing was really that I think that Bitcoin has no governance by design. So I think that I would describe governance as groups of humans in committees or organizations that are going to decide the rules of management of some institution or something. And so people use the word governance, and I think it just doesn't apply to Bitcoin. And without attributing ill intent, I'm sure everybody at the time on both sides of the fork drama was just trying to improve Bitcoin and make it available to more people. But the people that wanted big blocks seem to go about it in a sense of, well, they were going to make a run at it and set up a governance group of some companies and miners, and then they were going to tell the world how they were going to change Bitcoin. And that, I think, more than anything, was antithetical to what Bitcoin's about. You can't have a centralized governance process for a decentralized sort of permissionless system. It doesn't work. So I think that's what caused a lot of the backlash, that it wasn't. Bitcoin changes themselves are always opt-in, incremental improvements, don't deprive anybody of previous functionality. And so there's no governance, right? There's no rule change of anything invariant, like number of coins, the supply, censorship, backwards compatibility, all that stuff's invariant. And having a centralized governance puts that invariant at risk. So I think that was part of it. So for some people, they would have been happy with doubling the block size. They didn't really mind, but they weren't going to accept that being forced or pushed by a centralized governance process. So it was almost more about the way that it was proposed than what was proposed.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam.
My fellow plebs, the Bitcoin conference is back. Bitcoin 2022, April 6th through the 9th, is the ultimate pilgrimage for the Bitcoin ecosystem. The Bitcoin conference is the biggest event in all of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. We're leveling up and making this bigger and better than ever. I'm talking straight to the moon with the 4-day-long festival in the heart of Miami at the Miami Beach Convention Center. This has something for everyone, whether you're a high-powered Bitcoin entrepreneur, a core developer, or a Bitcoin newbie. Bitcoin 2022 is the ultimate place for you to be with your people and celebrate and learn about the Bitcoin culture. So make sure to go to b.tc/conference to lock in your official tickets and use promo code Satoshi for 10% off. Want more off? Pay in Bitcoin and you'll receive $100 off general admission and $1,000 off Whale Pass. Those are stackable. So go to b.tc/conference and attend the best conference in Bitcoin history. Yo, my fellow Bitcoin lovers, have I got something specifically curated for you. The Deep Dive is Bitcoin Magazine's premium markets intelligence newsletter. This isn't some paid group shilling buy and sell signals. No, this is a premium Bitcoin analysis led by Dylan LeClaire and his team of analysts. They break down in an easily digestible way what is happening on chain, in the derivatives markets, and in the greater macro backdrop context for Bitcoin. This newsletter turns volatility into a joke. So hit up members.bitcoin.magazine.com and use promo code podcast for 30% off the deep dive. That's members.bitcoinmagazine.com, promo code podcast for 30% off. Divorce your pay group and learn why Bitcoin is the strongest asset by Dylan and LeClaire and his team.
CK, we've got questions coming in. I feel like we could start taking some folks up here as well if you want. But talking about some of the idiosyncratic or like interesting features of Bitcoin that seemed weird maybe when you first looked at it, Adam, but maybe now seems more powerful. One person's asking about the halving and it being every 4 years instead of a continuous decrease. And maybe that having some very interesting kind of butterfly effects later. Like now it's clear that the halving will probably be some sort of like global holiday thing in the future, and that it really does interesting things with the currency markets. Do you want to weigh in on this particular feature and then maybe comment on some of the other like weird features of Bitcoin that you think maybe have become a big deal?
Hey, really quick, sorry to interrupt. Before you answer that question, Adam, if anyone wants to come up and ask a educated question, I will be screening folks to come up. And when you come up on stage, we're going to have you ask the question and I'm going to take you off stage. Feel free to request and I'll screen people to come up. But go for that question.
Oops. Are we still here?
Yeah. We can hear you.
Okay, that's right. Accidentally clicked on something still. I've got to click here.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, repeat the question. Distracted there.
Yeah, sorry, just the idiosyncratic kind of weird features of Bitcoin.
The halving.
The halving, the 4 years, and maybe any other features that you saw at the time that seemed weird, but now seem very powerful.
You could certainly say that Bitcoin could have been designed, that the technical specifics could have been different, and one would assume it wouldn't make much difference, right? 21 million coins versus 42. Think, okay, we'd be trading half Bitcoins and the rate of supply inflation would be the same. So that seems like a kind of arbitrary number. The halving is interesting because you could envisage it being a smooth curve, but now that we have it, it seems to create a kind of heartbeat economic cycle almost, which is maybe beneficial because there's going to be some kind of cycles anyway, and it punctuates it or something and kicks off new investment cycles or people to plan around. And so that's interesting. I think there are some kind of, just looking at the numbers, it seemed to me that there's some kind of like there are some close to power of 2 or close to power of 10 numbers coincidentally. The 144 blocks a day and 2016, almost a power of 2 blocks every 2 weeks, and a number of blocks in a halving. So some odd numbering systems that work out relatively elegantly. And the halving cycle is like some kind of interesting multiple of that, and yet almost coincides with a 4-year cycle, but not quite. So I guess you had to like tweak numbers to try and find pleasing sizes and periods that line up with weeks and years, even though they don't appear to be quite that. They're close. And another piece of reverse engineered, I don't know if it's true or not, but the claim about 21 million was that, I saw one of the developers mentioned this to me at some point, that an earlier version of Bitcoin had only 2 digits of precision below a Bitcoin, so like only down to bit cents. And so then 21 million becomes 2.1 billion bit cents, and that is coincidentally very close to the maximum sized integer you can fit in a signed 32-bit number that's common on CPU architecures. And that's plausible. And then the further divisibility came later, reportedly because Hal Finney said that it wasn't enough divisibility for the world. Hal Finney was, I think, within a few days of 2009, was estimating the addressable market of store of value in the world at around, $200 trillion or something, and the necessary divisibility of Bitcoin because of it, I guess.
Hal's a legend, so ahead of his time.
Yeah, that guy really gets around. He was in the remailers. He's in Alpal. Actually, he had an input to hashcash too. The first version of hashcash had a kind of double collision, and he made the observation that you could simplify it to one hash by making the collision with zeros instead. And there was somebody else that made the same observation, but I cited them in the paper when I wrote it later.
Alex, do you want to jump in, or I let
Aaron, do you
up on stage?
Yeah, Aaron, do you have something to say?
No, not really. I was just
okay.
Gonna
let's
go on.
No, I was just gonna say let's
start with Paulo. Paulo, why don't you get started? Please address a question to the panel, and then after that, make it succinct because I will be letting you down after that.
All right, thank you guys very much. Hey, Dr. Beck, I would like to ask you, what do you consider that is the most promising technology besides Lightning and Liquid?
So I think actually it leads to an interesting observation. So it seems to me that it's actually remarkably hard to improve Bitcoin. And I say that in a sense that it seems to surprise a lot of people. And I'll come back to your topic at the end of this comment. So it seems to surprise a lot of people. You get a new technology and people would think it's like the first car. Obviously, you can radically improve it, the first plane that just about flew. And so they assume that would be the case for Bitcoin's design. But if you're into like distributed systems and applied cryptography and networking and stuff, and you take a shot at it, and I spent 3 or 4 months trying to figure out if there's any way to improve anything about it in 2013, and pretty much concluded that, wow, there's almost nothing you can do. This design exists in a like really narrow pocket of design space where it works, but almost every variant you could think of to improve one aspect of it makes other aspects worse. Like it makes it more complicated, or it makes it more expensive, or so it's really hard to optimize. And I think the only really promising new technology that could change something fairly dramatically is the signatures of execution technology, which is newer than Bitcoin, dates back only a few years now. And that's, people will know that under snarks, starks, bulletproofs. So basically the idea that you can make a signature that can be verified by other people that proves to everybody that a given program was run on a data and returned true or something like that. So you can verify zero knowledge proof, and the data doesn't even have to be disclosed as well. So it has some quite interesting possibilities for privacy and scalability. But the technology is rapidly evolving. They are like CPU heavy, sometimes expensive to verify, or involve experimental crypto. So I think the bulletproof security assumptions are very good, like dependable, similar to Bitcoin, you can rely on. But that one is not as scalable. Like it's more CPU intensive to make the proofs and to verify the proofs, and they're not fixed size, they're log scaled. So it's still very impressive technology. But if that crosses over so that the reliable security assumption signatures of execution gets to a very scalable and efficiently verifiable stage, which it might do in the following years, that could be a very interesting and useful building block and potentially solve some scaling problems or move privacy forward.
Great. All right. Should we take the next one?
Yeah, let's go. I think the Roman hodler.
Hi, thank you for inviting me in. So I would like to ask Adam regarding the fee environment that we're in, considering that we are in all-time highs in prices and fees are still really low or in empty blocks. Considering that we will have to transition to a fee reward model within the next 10 to 15 years, where do you see the demand coming? Will it just be the increase in number of people? Or will we have to somehow find another way to get a sustained high fee environment to support the network? Thanks.
Yeah, I presume actually historically, I believe it's generally accepted that the reason fees get high is less to do with users and more to do with traders, because they're price insensitive, because they're doing large transactions and they're time sensitive. They want to clear the transaction so they can do the trade. They might lose money. And some of those activities have moved to key management systems so that funds can move between exchanges without going on the main chain increasingly. So that's taken some of those out. And then on the other end, retail transactions are increasingly using Lightning. Lightning adoption has grown rapidly. There's like literally millions of people in El Salvador using Lightning. So that takes a lot of traffic for kind of retail and micropayments off the main chain. And in terms of the kind of security budget for Bitcoin into the far future, I think that personally we have a long time. There is a kind of minimum fee rate. 1 Satoshi per VByte is at the network relay level. And as price increases, that provides a kind of floor, like minimum fee on the network. Just the price increase is making Bitcoin more expensive at a base level. And I think with the halving cycle, Bitcoin's price has grown a lot faster by a lot more than 2 times every 4 years. Let's put it that way. So it's probably some decades away. But as you say, it's eventually at the top of the S-curve when everybody that wants to use Bitcoin is using it. What happens? And there's less new coins being mined. What happens to security budgets? I think you could say that potentially the security budget is paying too much at the moment, possibly. And there are other things you can do to make the network immutable, miners that don't go backwards, like enforced by the ASICs and the hardware. And I think the other thing is that if you look at other money systems in the world, the infrastructure of the banking world, it's far less secure and reliable than Bitcoin's security model. It's basically the weakest link in the chain, and there are maybe 10,000 financial institutions, any one of which could have a database hacked and create $1 trillion, and it would take a while till anybody would discover it. So I think one answer is that money is a construct that humans need socially, and so there's an enormous economic incentive to find a solution. But that could include even that payment processors and exchanges and power users each do a little bit of mining, enough to be decentralized as a cost of doing business, even if there was break-even economics on it, because if society has a value for something, then they will find a way to do it. And you can see that actually in the way the internet works. So as a user of internet in a home environment, you don't see it because you just pay your internet bill. But out on the internet, there's peering arrangements where traffic has to route through different individual companies' infrastructure, and they work out agreements to transit each other's data, sort of tit for tat or something. There are ways for things to work if people need them to work. And the permissionless global electronic cash is an extremely valuable thing. So I think people will have an incentive to find ways to make that work, basically.
I know for a fact that my opinion here is much less valuable than Adam Back's, but I think the block reward is very underrated. My name right now, 37 sats. That's the block reward in 100 years. I think that's still going to be carrying its weight in terms of incentivizing the network. So get more bullish is what I would say. Let's go over to BK. What's your question?
Hey, thank you for having me on. Thank you, Professor Back, for explaining a lot of this. My question to you is, can you speak about the importance of running your own full node as a Bitcoin holder, as well as what it means to the network at large?
Yeah, I think it's important that it be possible for power users to run full nodes. And people will use the phrase, not your keys, not your coins. And that's obviously true because if you're using a custody solution, you really have an IOU. You don't actually have the coins, and the custodian could fail or freeze or seize your funds for somebody. But I think in a similar kind of direction, that running your own node actually provides you with a lot more protection from a security perspective. So it's a bit like having an anti-counterfeiting device. If you go into some stores, they put high denomination notes through a machine that tries to detect counterfeits. So it's having a node is a bit like that, and it ensures that, I think during the fork drama, where there were different hard forks running in parallel, it got choppy. And however, if you ran your own full node and you had your keys, there wasn't actually anything to worry about because the miners couldn't change the rules, because your node would silently and automatically reject anything that doesn't follow the network rules. So think about it. I think a phrase people use is that Bitcoin has a decentralized, impenetrable shield of verification or validation. And so the full nodes form part of that. But I think it's also true that a node doesn't really do that much unless the operator of it relies on it. So if you verify transactions you receive using it, then it is contributing value to the network, because if somebody sends you a coin and your node says it's invalid, you're going to not accept it. And that's going to cause the person that sends it you to realize they've been fooled or they're on a different network. And so that flows back through the network and means that even if some reasonable percentage of people and services and exchanges and wallets rely on nodes, that effectively the whole network very rapidly rejects anything that's not following the protocol rules.
Decentralization, I see you raising your hand. You want to direct a question to Mr. Adam Back? Or Doctor, I apologize. Decentralization, you got the floor. Sunny Koro. All right. Pavo, you want to take a question? Okay, go for it.
Yeah, thanks for this session. Learning a lot. Yeah, I'm based in Africa, and I noticed that from one of the stats I saw online one time, it says that Nigerians are really, about 30% of Nigerians are into crypto, and most of Nigerians go through they go through peer-to-peer platforms because Bitcoin is crypto in general is actually not so open, it's not so legal. Most of us go through exchanges like Binance and the other is it possible, say the Nigerian government, which I think government can say centralized exchange like Binance to stop peer-to-peer in Nigeria, country by country exchanges to prevent and what kind of implication would it have on the
So I'll repeat the question because it was a little hard to hear, but I think I got it. So basically, the person asking the question is saying that in Nigeria, Bitcoin is banned, and yet people are using it anyway and trading on foreign exchanges. And to what extent could governments in a given country effectively ban Bitcoin? And I think Nigeria is an interesting example because the ban seems to be ineffective, and I don't know if it's the case in Nigeria, but certainly in some countries and cultures, when you ban things, they get more popular. So yeah, I think it's actually quite hard to ban things because people can use them internationally. The internet is quite porous. There are VPNs, there's Tor. It's hard to practically stop people transacting with Bitcoin as long as there's an internet connection and people can install apps and things. So I think it's very difficult to stop. And to build on that, Blockstream, we deployed this Bitcoin satellite network to broadcast Bitcoin transactions and blocks and Lightning gossip data and actually the full history so that you can even sync a node over the satellite network, just basically to provide some additional redundancy and make it easier and lower cost to directly participate in the Bitcoin network by running a node without consuming a lot of bandwidth, because the bulk bandwidth to sync a node can get expensive. So that also makes it, harder to censor because you can then participate with Bitcoin on much lower bandwidth, which could be sending a transaction. Transactions are very small. You can send them in an SMS message. I think that in a way, the footprint of Bitcoin being small, that it doesn't consume an enormous amount of resources and bandwidth, means that it's harder to censor and detect. And being able to receive the bulk data not fully anonymously and read-only over satellite means that it's virtually impossible to detect if you are even running a full node. And then if you send a transaction, it's very small and much easier to hide in the noise.
All right, we have about 15 minutes left, I think, and then I'm going to start wrapping it up a little bit. I think we can only take 3 or 4 more questions. I want to pass it to Tomer to present a question, and I'm going to start letting some people off stage, unfortunately, so I apologize for folks who didn't get to ask their question. But Tomer, go for it.
Great, thanks. I just want to make sure you guys can hear me. Okay, great. Adam, it's such an honor to get to ask you a question. One of the things I find so amazing is just your enormously calm demeanor as you've lived through the prehistory of Bitcoin and then through the history of it as well. For so many of us who have only discovered the existence of this technology since Bitcoin, and we get blown away by these numbers that cryptographers deal with. A hash rate right now is like 140 million trillion hashes every second. It's such an unimaginable number, and it can consume so much energy, and it like skips along without even being challenged, because the number that is 256 bits is so big that you can be doing quintillions of calculations a second and not even putting any pressure on it. And part of my question is, so many of us are just blown away when we hear these numbers, and our jaws just slack, and we can't even fathoming them, let alone people inventing things with them as you have. And so part of the question that I have is just like, are you blown away frequently by the kind of inventions as you tumble down the rabbit hole and you're putting on a very calm face first? Or is it just that as you've come through this, you've always had the calm demeanor, or as you've watched it grow, that just lets you see this without having your mind blown all the time? It's a bit of a personal question, but does your mind get blown all the time?
I think actually it may not be intuitive to, everybody, but I think everybody is learning about Bitcoin, including the people writing the lowest level bits of consensus code or so on, because it's such a complicated, in some way it's superficially simple and you can understand it at different levels as you get more involved in it. But the combination of economics of it and how it resists unwanted change, I think lots of people learn things about that over time. and about the system in general. So I think I think everybody is learning as we go. So I think it may be a factor about society that, society learning about things actually takes decades. We'll often look at historic things and think that looks simple, or that seems obvious, or that doesn't work anymore. But actually, the conventions for companies organized with shares, or how society manages business and things like that, are actually incrementally improved over hundreds of years, and actually quite complex, elegant systems. So I think Bitcoin has some of that going on, that we're still really getting to grips with what it is and what it can do, and how it can operate on its own as a kind of organism or a system with assistance of its own. Yeah. And I'm not somebody to, I have, in terms of getting excited about things, I'm more of a mindset to not get mad, but get even. I just want to see things succeed. So I just keep optimizing and trying to solve problems. And so I think it's easy, and you saw this on the Cypherpunks list, to get mad, like it's so wrong what the government's doing. This is a policy abuse. They're depriving people of rights. But the other approach is to say, okay, I agree with all of that, but you don't actually achieve anything by getting mad about it. What you want to do is build a system to, change the balance of power and succeed that way. So what matters is the result, and focusing on the price, something like that.
All right, let's go as quickly as
possible. The gratitude that I have for you, and I know so many other people do, is immeasurable. Sorry, I'll go.
Sorry about that, Tomer. We're trying to go quick. Big love for Adam back. Thank you so much for the time too, Adam. Yasin, why don't you go? Let's try to keep it brief. Then we're going to go Vivek, and then close it out with Log, and then want to give it back to Alex to maybe direct some closing words.
Hey, Dr. Beck, this might be a silly question, but would it be possible for Blockstream to create a multi-signature hardware wallet that requires no third-party custodial? And the reason why I ask is because in the US right now, there's this IRS bill that they're trying to pass where they want to audit anyone and everyone with more than $600 in their bank accounts. So my concern with the third-party custodials is that perhaps the government leak into their Bitcoin balances.
Yeah, actually, coincidentally, and probably it's not very well documented, the Green Wallet works on both Bitcoin and Liquid. And on Liquid, there's confidential transactions, which hides the values. And so it's actually the case, which is mind-blowing if you start to think about it, that the Green sort of two-factor authentication server, which is providing security in a way, it doesn't actually know how much you're transferring or even what type of asset it is. So you can get a third-party security service that doesn't have visibility into how much you're transacting or what asset you're transacting, and yet can assist you in doing two-factor authentication security. And if you lose your two-factor authentication device, or after a time period, the small Bitcoin smart contract attached to the coin says that after 90 days, you can move it, you can bypass that. If you lose a two-factor, you just wait for the contract time lock to expire, and then you can just spend it without it. As long as you haven't lost your two-factor and you're continuing to authenticate. So that means you can get some very interesting hybrids of privacy, security, and self-custody, basically. And smart contracts are very flexible, interesting things, and I think there are probably many more such interesting things that can be built to come with the key management and ease of use and assisting people to avoid losing their funds. So you have your own keys, but if you lose them, that's a big problem. So what I'm saying is I think there remain interesting ways that the safety of avoiding key loss can be achieved to improve on it.
Vivek, why don't you jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I have a good segue, essentially. In bull runs, we increasingly hear the false statement that Bitcoin doesn't have smart contracts. So I wanted to ask Adam, is there anything that excites him about script, whether it's opcodes or other primitives? What's most promising, or what interests you?
Yeah, I think obviously Bitcoin had a smart contracting system from the beginning. It's just one that is focused on being secure and securable, right, and scalable. And of course, Bitcoin has added incremental improvements over time, the CSV, SegWit, some more programmable log times, and now Taproot and Schnorr signatures. And there are more things that people are exploring to add. And another kind of more next generation smart contracting plan that may work its way into Bitcoin longer term is a smart contracting system called Simplicity. And it's actually conceived of by Russell O'Connor, I think it's in 2012 in IRC discussions. So some people may have heard of MAST. So actually the full story for MAST is a language designed around that from scratch, which is called Simplicity. And so we at one point were able to recruit Russell O'Connor to actually build that. And he's been working on that quite a few years now. And we're expecting to have that in Liquid early next year. And you can download kind of developer releases of Bitcoin branches with Simplicity integrated and Liquid with Simplicity integrated. And it's a very interesting language because it makes the Bitcoin scripting model self-extensible, so you can approximately add new opcodes. So if Simplicity was in Bitcoin today, you would be able to implement Schnorr signatures as a small extension without needing a soft fork, for example. And the other point about Simplicity is that it's based on a low-level mathematical formal logic, kind of assembly language level at the base. And so everything about the extensions and scripts you use is mathematically defined and can be fed to a proof assistant to make formal proofs about the correctness of a program. And actually the Simplicity interpreter is able to, you can make proofs about the Simplicity interpreter itself. And one very interesting proof is that the Simplicity interpreter will correctly interpret all Simplicity programs, which is a kind of very strong guarantee, but you can prove many things about it. The maximum runtime of a script, the maximum amount of memory a script can use, or the only categorize and assure yourself that the only scenarios where money can be spent from the script is a small list of intended outcomes, and prove that is correct also. So I think that is pretty interesting for the future. And another kind of interesting crossover is we mentioned briefly bullet proofs, which are a kind of secure way to do the signature of execution with some very conservative security assumptions. And those are based on zero-knowledge proofs and circuits. So it turns out to be possible to compile Simplicity assembly code into a bulletproof. So those two things fit quite well together because with Simplicity, you have some security and semantics tools to have confidence that your program is going to do what you think it's going to do. And then by compiling it into a bulletproof, you can get privacy and a zero-knowledge proof that the program executed on some undisclosed data. So you can get privacy on top of it. So the usual problem with snarks and bulletproofs and things like that is you first have to design by hand a circuit that does what you want, and that's complicated and you could make a mistake with it. So the fact that you could compile it is interesting too, and an area for future development. So I think those kind of security first approaches will be very interesting to see come to play. And I think Bitcoin, it takes some time between the technology being developed and the thorough security review and quality assurance and peer review until things make their way into Bitcoin. The Schnorr signature was first discussed in 2013 IRC discussions as a potentially interesting for Bitcoin. And over time that became more concrete and some developers started working on the details and implementing it in a library and so forth. And now here we are today with Schnorr signatures in Bitcoin. So I'm not saying that something like Simplicity is going to come that soon, but it is a path that could potentially achieve the ossification objective of largely freezing the base layer of programmability so that you could do more general things on top of a secure base without having to have further softforks, I guess.
Very thorough answer. Thank you very much. Alex, we're pretty much hitting end of time. How do you want to conclude this? Do you want a last word or?
Sure. I just wanted to thank you, Adam, so much for your time. It's been really illuminating. We'll end with a reflection on the one piece that you were, when you were initially designing hashcash, this idea of the faster computers could always create more monetary supply. This was fixed through like the difficulty algorithm in a way. How was, one last reflection from you before we break, what was it like watching half the network hash rate collapse because the world's largest government essentially almost attacked Bitcoin, and then you're watching the network be so resilient that it could just soldier on and now getting back close to all-time hash rates? What is your general summation of this difficulty algorithm, and how important is it to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think it's one of the innovations that enables Bitcoin in a way, because without it, the economics don't look like they would converge. So it would lose sort of integrity of the economic base or something. But yeah, the exodus of hash rate from China, we've seen a few situations where people get worried about dramatic changes. Some people thought the halving would create a death spiral, or too many transactions will clog up blocks. The blocks got slower due to a sudden drop in hash rate. But in practice, the network is extremely robust. And I think the media doesn't help, because they will amplify what ifs without fully understanding the sort of economics and technical mechanisms that will dynamically cope with things. So it seems that Bitcoin is like very robust. And of course, it's also meta robust in the anti-fragility sense that if a real issue is to arise, that there's a financial incentive for all of the very technically capable and ingenious people working on it to fix the problem, basically. Whether that is to do with the governance drama that was resolved by humans and the market, or a technical risk that materializes. So I think the combination of human ingenuity and the market and robust, elegant, and simple base layer makes it an incredibly robust system.
Great. Thank you. CK, thanks for hosting. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Pete. And just massive thanks to Adam, to Dr. Beck, not just for his time today, but for all of his contributions to privacy and to freedom and to Bitcoin. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was an amazing conversation. I can pay y'all no higher compliment than I said absolutely nothing. So thank you all.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we're going to close this one out. Alex, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing for Bitcoin Magazine and writing The Quest for Digital Cash. For everyone who listened to this entire conversation, I know many of you did, make sure to go click into the pinned tweet up top. That'll take you to Alex's mega thread and a link to his full article where you can dive into this history and the story of discovering digital cash and all the dynamics that are a part of that story. I know that Mr. Pete Rizzo has a lot of fantastic work about the early days of cypherpunks and Satoshi, and Aaron is the OG Bitcoin historian. So look up both of their works as well on Bitcoin Magazine. And yeah, thank you to everyone who listened this entire time. I got to show the Bitcoin conference, Bitcoin 2022. Use a promo code. What is it? Promo code
HFSP.
We got Yeah, HFSP, have fun staying poor, and get your ticket before prices. I believe Adam is going to be speaking there, so don't miss him there.
He definitely is.
And yes, and the Print Bitcoin magazine as well. So check that out, promo code BR, to get your print magazine for the El Salvador edition of the Bitcoin magazine. Alex has an article in there. Aaron has an amazing article in there. Rizzo has added to it. So it's a piece of history that you got to get. And yeah, with that, I will close it out. Thanks again to everyone, and see you in Miami. Peace.
Adios.
Thank you.